Chair, and I thank our witnesses for their time and for their service to our country. Ms. Lenihan, I understand that Russia has been expanding its footprint in Sudan and is considering establishing a naval base near Port Sudan. But after months of protests against the autocratic regime, Russian-backed Omar al-Bashir has been deposed in a peaceful coup. Will regime change in Sudan increase or diminish the likelihood of an enhanced Russian presence in Sudan, and how would this affect U.S. interests?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Russia also is a strategic concern for the United States, as outlined within the National Defense Strategy, and we do see increasing interest on the continent. In the context of Sudan, there certainly is a relationship. The situation is obviously very dynamic at present as far as what will occur within that country with the transitional military.
Will the regime change, do you think, increase or diminish the likelihood of their enhanced Russian presence?
I'd say it would be difficult to tell, but certainly once there's an established relationship, that could be affected once that leader is gone.
Ambassador Nagy, Russia's actions in Sudan look a lot like its activities in Venezuela and Syria to me. What do you think Russians' intentions are, and what lessons should the U.S. draw from the Syria and Venezuela scenarios?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. I believe that Russia is very opportunistic in Africa. They don't have the resources of China. They certainly don't have the resources of the United States. They look for places where they can cause trouble, basically, and poke us in the eye, or as in the Central African Republic specifically, poke the French in the eye. We just have to be very careful and block wherever we can. You asked about Sudan. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping that if the transition in Sudan goes in the direction it does go in, we end up with a civilian-controlled government, then they will have a totally different view of Russia than the government that they will be replacing.
We absolutely are all hoping for that. Mr. Day, I am so glad that you highlighted the centrality of women's empowerment in achieving sustainable development goals. Education and economic empowerment for women have positive ripple effects in developing countries all across the globe. I am particularly interested in efforts to reduce the gender gap in property ownership in sub-Saharan Africa, where the World Bank found that men are almost 3 times more likely than women to own property by themselves. This disparity has wide-ranging economic consequences for women and their daughters. Can you tell me how USAID is working to reduce gender gaps in property ownership in sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you, Congresswoman. This is absolutely vitally important to Africa's development, so thank you for raising it. It's also vitally important to many of the countries that I've worked in my career, including the Middle East. But it's probably even more so, I think, in Africa, in that I sometimes say that these economies are not going to succeed if they only use half their brain. And I think that's never more true than in Africa. And so women need access to not only land rights, but also education, and they need access to finance so that they can access markets. They need to have access to networks. But then also there's a regulatory and a policy and a legal and a cultural environment that needs to also be changed, and that's exactly what USAID is doing in the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, WGDP.
Right.
So we're really looking forward to digging in our heels in the program.
Well, let me know how we can be helpful, because I see it as really the only way forward, and the property ownership gap is outrageous at the moment. I have a little bit of time left, so Mr. Day, Tanzania has long been considered a democratic success story. However, current President John Magufuli, I believe, has begun to violate democratic norms in the name of eradicating corruption. Can you tell me how USAID is working to prevent democratic backsliding in Tanzania?
Thank you again for the question. And as the Assistant Secretary and I have had numerous conversations about this, lamenting about the
Yes.
developments in Tanzania, we are deeply concerned about the rhetoric coming out of Tanzania, not only from a human rights perspective, but from a democracy perspective as well, and a business perspective, because there are a lot of American businesses who are waning their interest in Tanzania because of the developments there. Now, we have continued to work on our health programming, particularly PEPFAR, which is vitally important in Tanzania. But a lot of our programming has really had to shift away from support and partnership directly with the government as a result of these developments. And we're now really focused more on civil society and independent media. And that's where we've shifted a lot of our programs.
Well, I really hate to see the backsliding. And Ambassador Nagy, I know I'm out of time, but I would be very much interested in your perspective on this too. And certainly I think our committee would. So either in writing or perhaps would be
Sure.
would be best.
Very quickly. Tanzania is especially sad because that was one of the beacons
Right.
of democracy through Africa's history and decolonization. So it is hurtful to the entire continent and the Friends of Africa. And our embassy, believe me, is extremely engaged across the whole spectrum of interlocutors of making the point, trying to promote democracy, and also trying to help those organizations that are Tanzanian
Right.
and are trying to hold on to democracy, because there's a danger of it evolving into what we would call a Potemkin democracy, where you have the structures of democracy but without anything really behind it.
Well, the backslide is just terrible. And I appreciate the chair's indulgence and for your tremendous service and work in the area.
And Representative